Well, hello, and thank you for joining us yet again for another episode of the Map Room podcast, where normally this is the point where I say that our knowledge and experience can help you make better decisions to hopefully get better outcomes for your business. But I want to reflect on decisions today because it's only half the story. 4 years ago, when we started this podcast, we spoke about what we called the concept of intentional, circumstantial, and consequential decision making. But we really need to think about the execution. There's a famous phrase that says an idea is just a vision without execution. So today I want to look at execution and to put some context into it. We talk to lots of clients for whom we will help them build an annual budget for their business. And very often the owner of that business or the leadership team wants something different in the upcoming year. It might be growth, it might be a new product, it might be many, many things. And we will help them plan for that and we'll put it into a budget. And very often we will sit down at a quarterly review and look at maybe a reforecast. And there often seems to be instances where the team have hit a brick wall or they've hit some obstacles. And they'll say to us things like, well, we agreed this or we planned for this. Why aren't my team doing what I've asked of them? Why are they not taking the appropriate action? Really big one, why aren't they excited about this change? So today I want to talk about inertia. I want to talk about the causes of it and the impact of it on your agency. So I'm delighted to say returning to the Map Room for another victorious episode is a subject matter expert we've had talking to us last year, and that is Caroline Canty from Craft Coaching. So Caroline, thank you so much for coming back into the Map Room. And again, I'm looking forward to another great conversation with you.
No, thank you for having me again. I'm glad to be here and I'm glad to be talking about change adoption and getting buy-in from your team 100%.
So let's start with some, I suppose, definitions. I think 99% of the population would understand inertia as somebody not doing something. But if we get it right, inertia can be a positive way because it can actually be, the classic definition is actually somebody not changing movement. So if we get everyone going in the right direction, sometimes inertia can be positive because they don't step out of the plan. But let's talk about it in the obstacle sense. So what's inertia to you? How do you recognize it either in the businesses you've worked with or with other areas?
So I've always found the concept of inertia to be fascinating because for me, it's the real tie between mind and body, which when you're doing performance coaching is a big part of this, even in businesses. So if a lot of people that will hear inertia probably know it from the physics sense, because I think that's probably what most people learn when they're in school, and that's where they'll kind of hear it around before they get to personal development and stuff like that. And you would taught, if we go right back then, to the three versions of inertia. And the interesting thing is that they all show up in the workplace as well. So you have inertia of rest, inertia of motion, and inertia of direction. Inertia of rest is where you have the resistance of a resting object to being moved, right?
Yeah.
So I'm here, I'm happy, I'm comfortable, I don't want to move. You then have inertia of motion, which is the resistance of a moving object to being slowed down, which again, we put it in the workplace, you see the exact same thing. You see that people, when they're pushing, persisting, just cracking on with actions, they don't want to be stopped. They don't want to change. They don't want to do something different. They want to carry on. Because if we keep carrying on doing what we're doing, we're alive, and that's great, and that's all we care about. Versus inertia of direction is where you have the resistance of an object to changing its path. And a couple of examples, which again, going back to like physics class in school, were like seat belts, So the idea is that if you were in a crash, your body would continue to move forward even though the car has stopped, because that's the inertia of motion. And then you have something like the tablecloth trick. So, like when you whip the tablecloth and then everything hopefully stays the same.
Never managed to do it, but I know what you mean.
Yeah, that's because those objects don't want to be moved. So that's the inertia of rest. So there's lots of like little real world examples of that physics being put to the test. But in the workplace, the most common places where you see it are things like people don't want to be moved if we're comfortable. We've covered that. So burnout is actually a great example. burnout through like persistence is inertia of motion, because people don't want to stop. They're afraid to stop. They're afraid to drop that momentum. They just keep going and keep going and keep going until they crash. So actually burnout's a really good example of kind of inertia, but in a personal development space. Or people just keep, like the inertia of direction one, people keep going, doing the same thing, and yet expecting different results, which we all know is the definition of insanity. So in every instance, I always found it fascinating. The first time that I started to include kind of inertia as part of my like change adoption, like training for leadership and stuff like that, was this idea that whether it is in the world of physics and it's an object in mass, which is the reason for inertia in physics, is mass, or whether it's in the mind, there's this relationship between the physical world and the mindset world, and still there is a place of inertia. And to me, coming back to your original question of like, what does it mean? What are the kind of blockers that we see? Well, we see them in a few examples there in the workplace, but the real root cause for it in the workplace would be fear. And this comes back to our conversation last year when we were talking about stress and all of these things. Because if mass is the thing that creates inertia in the physical world, in the mental and psychological world, it is fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of doing something different, fear of what lies on the other side of inertia.
Fear of fear itself is something I coined a while ago, and I think it's still so valid.
Yeah, it is. And then we're all obviously onto the question of, well, why? Why does that cause this reaction? Why does this happen? And it's because the human brain is wired to resist threats at all costs to keep us alive. And unfortunately for businesses, growth means change. Change in the mind and body is perceived as a threat. Cue the inertia. So that's why we end up in the situation that we do when we're trying to grow in businesses, and yet people aren't showing up and taking the action. Things seem to slow down for no reason. People just stop or they won't move. And this is why. It's that fear response, that stress stimulus reaction at the heart.
How do you see that? Because we're big fans of what we call value-based interviews at MAP. And we ask questions against a certain set of values. And one of the questions I ask is, when was the last time you were brave? And it's fascinating how people see different versions of that word. So I would also suggest it's the same to say, if I reversed that and said, when was the last time you felt threatened or frightened, I'd get this massive scale. So what are the sort of common indicators of someone? If someone is, apart from, I suppose, rabbit in the headlights, classic, how would you recognize fear in somebody?
Okay, so first of all, we have to understand how resilience builds up over time. And again, we can take like the physical realm again. We can look at the body and how that builds resilience as an example, because let's take strength training. Okay, you go to the gym, you lift a weight. It feels really, really heavy. You're sore afterwards. When you're sore afterwards, it's because your muscle fibers have broken down under the stress, under the tension. There is a stress stimulus there, sends signals to the body, right, we need to regrow this. It needs to be stronger, because if this is the sort of thing we're going to be doing more often, then we got to adapt. We got to survive. So in that instance, you do it again, and actually, no, I feel okay today. I don't have any soreness. I don't have anything. Okay, well, then we increase the weight. And over time, your muscles get stronger, bigger, etc. Resilience has been built to a certain stressor. Let's now adapt the same thing to the workplace, which is why if you were to ask somebody at interview stage, like, when was the last time you were afraid or something like that, it'd be completely different for everybody. But more specific than that, taking away things like, they have a fear of spiders or something like that, more specifically to fears in the workplace that show up, things like having difficult conversations, leadership challenges, conflict with clients, really difficult, all these sorts of things. Again, we're looking at the same process. People build resilience at different rates over different things based on the experiences that they've had, the psychological development that's already there, and the mindset that they apply every day when they show up, which is why leadership can come really naturally to some people if they've already got some resilience in that area. Maybe they had difficult conversation training at a younger age because of a certain company that they were in, and then they become a manager elsewhere, and oh my God, you're really good at it. It doesn't faze you at all. Well, no, because they've built a resilience to it. And now this is where we get into how I mean, we're kind of touching on how you can actually start to rewire the mind. So I'll stop with that one.
You've said something there that fascinates me. So you're saying that there is almost a physical ability.
Yes.
Let's just use you said there about going to the gym. So your
Yeah.
body in sort of repairing itself and preparing itself
Yes.
allows you to be, I'm going to say, more reactive. So let's just say lose weight, put weight on, whatever your sort of goals
whatever
are
your
with
goals
the
are.
gym. It seems to be that the brain seems to either overrule that. So if you're telling me that you can be physically wired to build muscle, why is your brain then, to me, wired to see that fear?
I'm really glad that you've asked this. So in the brain, we're looking at the fact that we have been hardwired for hundreds of thousands of years to find threats. Okay. So we're wired every single day when we open our eyes and we leave the house to go to work, or we switch on the laptop and go to work, to look for threats to our survival. So the mind's job hasn't changed. How that translates in the body, in the example that I use for building resilience to things, is that, and the difference with the body is that it's adapting to the environment that it's in. So if you're quite happy just wherever you are, like you're happy with your muscle mass and your fat mass and everything else, and you don't want to change anything, then your body will resist change it. And that's the thing. It is resisting change, because when you go to the gym and you pick up something that's incredibly heavy and you've never done it before, you hurt afterwards. That is the resistance, because the muscle fibers are broken down.
Often called resistance training, but maybe not for that reason.
Resistance training, but exactly that. It's providing the body with resistance. Why? Because we need a stimulus in order to grow. And it's exactly the same in the body as it is in the mind. We need a stimulus in order to grow. In the body, it's, I'm going to lift this really heavy thing and break down those muscle fibers, giving them a signal we need to grow. I expect more of you. I expect you to turn up and be able to lift heavier things. I want more from you, but it needs a stimulus in order to do it. The mind is exactly the same. If you just carried on carrying on, then you'd never accrue any more life experiences, and the tiniest thing would scare you as a threat because you're not used to dealing with anything outside of that experience. The thing is, we are putting our minds under so much more regular pressure and regular threats. It's overwhelmed all the time and doesn't know how to deal with them. That's why it feels so much more chaotic than something a lot simpler than turning up to the gym. But the process is the same. You turn up to the gym, you need a stimulus in order to trigger growth. If you want growth of the mind, if you want a better, stronger mindset, if you want more resilience, you need a stimulus to do it. The stimulus is the thing that, oh my God, this is really uncomfortable and I hate it. But then you need a strategy for handling it, dealing with it, building resilience. And if you do that over and over and over again, well, if you lift the same weight over and over again, it becomes easier, right? If you tackle the same difficult conversation over and over again, it becomes easier, right? But you need a stimulus to change, and you need a strategy for how to actually use that stimulus to your advantage.
Okay, so are you saying this? If you say, and let's just use this gym analogy again. So you're saying
that... Yeah, it's a good one.
Yeah, so we can train the body, yeah. Can you train your brain to react differently?
Absolutely. Absolutely you can. It's hard. Don't get me wrong, but so is training the body, right? You have to show up and take the action. And that's, again, it's the same for the mind and the body. You have to show up and take the action if you want the result. If you want to be able to tackle senior leadership discussions and commercial strategic level thinking, then you have to show up and take the action that's going to allow you to do that. The same way as if you want to build, I don't know, another 20 pounds of muscle, you need to show up and take the action. The thing is, most people will roughly know, because there's a lot out there that, you go to the gym and you do this and you do that, and it's a lot simpler. The mind is often a lot more complex because we each have our own past mindset challenges. We all have our own predispositions towards things that we find easier or more difficult. There's so much more going on in the mind, and there's often a lot more baggage in the mind. Previous trauma that you may be dealing with, things like that can hold you back and provide you with blockers to achieving what you want. So can you retrain the mind? 100%. How do I know? I was my very first client. Okay. So if I can come from a place of depression and chronic anxiety and like everything in between, if I can do it, anybody can do it. But the most critical factor, and any coach will tell you this, is that you have to want to do it. The only type of person that cannot be coached is one that doesn't want to be coached. You have to want it. It has to be strong enough. And this kind of comes back to, probably something that we'll pick up on later, which is, well, how do you instill this within businesses? Well, one of the things I always say is that if you want change adoption, you have to do two things. You have to have, yes, the shiny reward figured out, like where we're all going, the opportunity, the big shiny thing that we're all going to have. You also need a risk of staying the same. You need a threat stimulus. Again, you need a stimulus to grow. So it's not enough to have the shiny reward, because loads of people would love to look a certain way or have a certain bank account figure or have whatever it happens to be personally, all the way through to businesses that would love to hit a certain revenue growth. But are you prepared to show up and take the action even when it's uncomfortable? And then you need the strategies for those days when they are really uncomfortable.
Interesting. I think you're saying there, and I suppose it's this fine line maybe between, as you say, what is fear and comfort. And we talk about the comfort zone. And we see it very often with agencies who have a natural tendency to grow and wonder why they're not growing. You said something that fascinated me there. And you have told me this before, and I had forgotten about you being your first client.
Yes.
How do you recognize it? So I don't wish to take you back and trauma and all the rest of it, but for you obviously to take that step forward, you had to recognize something in yourself. And I don't know whether it's easier to recognize it in yourself than others. So if you are that leader in that business, how do you recognize it in one or two people first? Do you recognize it in yourself? How do you recognize the reactive versus responses versus entrenched positions that you spoke about before?
Okay, so there's a couple of ways that we can look at this. The first, the simplest, the most obvious, is that somebody is saying one thing and yet creating results that indicate another. And that is your most classic example of where a coaching approach as a leader is warranted, because they need a perspective shift and they need help getting there. Because for whatever reason, they think that they're all right. They don't see it. And often this is the problem, because the brain runs away from threats. They might not be able to see it in themselves. And they need somebody to say, well, look, I need you to help me out here. You're saying that you're fine and that everything's good and all of this stuff that you've said. But here's what I'm seeing. I'm seeing the fact that you've delayed that conversation now for 3 weeks. I'm seeing the fact that the results of the department are not there. I'm seeing whatever your evidence is, right?
Yeah.
So you got to help me out here. I've got a discrepancy between the two. You've got to help me. What's going on? That's your kind of entry point. So the very, very simplest way that you can see it is that somebody's actions is not equating to the result that it should be. However, deeper than that is another layer. And we're looking at things now in terms of how do you spot things like burnout and things like, where you've got a high stress situation and they're not aware of it. And there's lots of ways that we can see this. And this is where things like your higher metrics would be things like, well, absenteeism's a really easy one, but presenteeism, well, how the hell do you measure that? How do you measure if somebody is showing up and being there, but isn't there mentally in the best way? So how do you see it as a leader in those scenarios? You're looking for things like loss of motivation, because humans need a purpose. We need a purpose. That's why in businesses that don't have a clear vision, purpose, reason for being, people leave because they feel like they're in a sinking ship. They don't really know why they're there. They need to feel as though they're part of something. And that comes back to our wiring as being part of a social group. And one of the key drivers of human social behavior is relatedness. We need to feel exactly. And when people are under stress, that's the part of the brain that's switched on, right?
Yeah.
So we've got to recognize that. So things like loss of motivation, sustained lack of focus, like they're not on the ball in the same way that they used to. And this is the difference when we're starting to stack these things up between a pattern and just look, if it's a one-off, they might be having a bad day. If it's a couple of times, okay, maybe it's a coincidence, but 3 or more, we're into a pattern of behavior here. So, if you get somebody that's always been a little bit ditzy, that might be them as a person. There's nothing wrong. But if we're seeing a change in regular behavior towards a negative in whatever phase, sustained lack of focus, loss of motivation, skipping of breaks and not taking holidays is a big one. That is the classic example of inertia of motion. They are resistant to stop, and they'll come up with reasons to not do it because they feel like if they stop, everything will fall apart. Then you've got things like the everything's fine example that we use. So if somebody on your team is saying, oh no, I'm fine. Well, that's where you lean back into the simplest observation is that their actions don't stack up against the results. And it's our job to see the discrepancy between the two. And this is where we get into the individual nuance of whoever your team members are. If you are concerned that there's a mindset problem there, then you have to first of all, stack up whether this is a pattern. Maybe when you hired them, they were super on the ball. And then for whatever reason, now they're making stupid mistakes regularly. They are missing things. Their memory isn't the same. They're not taking all of these things. Well, what does all that come back to? Reduced executive function of the brain. Think of it in terms of a business. The executive function is there to direct, right? And it's the exact same thing in the brain. So where you have prolonged presence of stress in an individual leaning towards burnout, things like memory, decision making, all of those things are reduced. Why are they reduced? Because cortisol shuts them off. Stress affects, and it's been proved in many studies, stress drops your IQ points, literally, because it doesn't care about giving you space to be creative or proactive or any of that. It cares about self-preservation and immediately what is in front of you. So the other thing is that people will stop looking at the long-term picture, or they'll become obsessed with comparisonitis or shiny object syndrome, because again, they're looking at survival and they're looking at things that will save them in those instances. So whether it's externalized or whether it's internalized, there's a few examples of ways that we can see it in individuals, but it always comes back to if they're taking action and it's not producing the result, there's an issue there, either through their own perspective or the process that's in place to get them there.
Again, incredible. You've made me think something there, which is very often when we have these conversations, we're talking through the lens of our client or the business owner looking at maybe their business and their team. And you've just said something to me there that said, when I gave a context, I said very often we'll sit with a client and we'll look at a 12-month budget. And when we'll sit there and do a review, sometimes there's genuine reasons, sometimes there's excuses why things haven't been done. And you said there, when you recognize that maybe the delivery or the actions were not the same as what people said. Now,
yes.
We can see that with our clients, and we know then there's potentially an issue. But I suppose let's turn this around to our clients' clients. So very often in the creative space, there is that thing where suddenly somebody will say, we're flavor of the month and now we're not, or we thought what we thought was this amazing campaign and now we're no longer on the roster, or whatever it is. I suppose I started this conversation talking about the leadership and the team, so within the agency. But maybe what's your views on saying to somebody now, if you could be in that leadership position, you could just be in an account management position, you could be in a client services position. How do you recognize those same issues maybe in your clients? So we've said we're going to review this campaign, or we're going to sit down to discuss next quarter's budget. We get pipeline a lot now, Caroline, with people saying, look, we're just not getting the visibility. And it's making me wonder now whether if you're saying, well, hang on a minute, last month we said we were going to sit down and look at next quarter's budget. Now you keep either not taking my calls or cancelling the meetings. Maybe that's an example of where you should be recognising that inertia in your client. Is that a fair point?
100%, yes. Because when we look at inertia in like a commercial context, which is where a lot of businesses care about it, because that's really how we judge growth, right? Is it commercials? And it doesn't matter whether you are reflecting on a campaign that maybe didn't get the results that you wanted, or whether you are planning for the next quarter or doing an annual strategy. Strategies do not fail because people fail to create a strategy. They fail because people don't show up and take the action. And whether that is the agency or whether it's the agency's client, if people don't show up and take the action, guess what? You don't get the result that you want. Just because you think, I would love that dream body and an extra 20 pounds of muscle doesn't mean it's magically going to appear. If you think about it and visualize it, you've got to show up and take the action. We come back again to that idea of, well, how do we then get around inertia in clients, not even just internally with stakeholders, but with clients as well? And it's still the same thing. We need, yes, the shiny reward. If we're dealing with a client that's not showing up and taking the action, how do you deal with that? Well, first of all, you have to reconnect with them on the goals that they want for the company, because that is usually always tied to a vision. Visions are always more emotional. And this is something that I do whenever I go into a business, especially if I'm working with client services teams, account growth, whatever. They're so used to going through the motions of stuff like onboarding. And often, whoever closed that original deal with the client will have worked out what their vision was and the wider why and all that kind of stuff.
Or
But actually,
assumed, which is always a risk, isn't it?
maybe, yeah, never assume. Assume
Yeah.
nothing. First rule of leadership, assume nothing. But let's say that they have done their duty and they've, they really worked hard on that client and they really got to know them, they built that connection, and then they handed it over to the client services, project management, account management, whatever. And it's unfortunately rare, and I've worked with a lot of businesses, it's unfortunately rare that that vision is rarely ever carried over. It's not part of the onboarding. So when you come to either do account growth, upselling opportunities, performance enhancement, etc., whenever you come to do that, the emotional connection is missing and people buy based on emotion. Again, we're back to the primitive part of the brain. That's the one that will make decisions like that. So if you have a client that's not showing up and giving you all the things that they were supposed to in order to make that campaign or whatever it was that your service is successful, then the first thing you have to do is remind them of that connection to the bigger why. Like, we started working together because you really wanted X. And I'm not talking about a revenue fit or we want more sales or whatever it happens to be. I'm talking about, why do you want more sales? It can't just be about a number. It has to be about something bigger. Well, it's because we want greater, we want to grow our company internationally. We want to acquire more business. That is what you hook onto. So when you are trying to develop it, that sense of momentum again with a client, tie them back to the original connection you had, the original reason for the relationship, the reason they picked you, which is probably about the vision. And also, again, we're back to the risk of staying the same. Look, guys, if you don't give us this stuff that we've asked for, we're not going to hit what you want. And that's not on us. That's on your team. We're in this together. And we want to help you and we want to be there and we want to do all the great things and we want to provide you with that vision and we want to get there together. But we can't do it if we don't show up and take the action. The risk of staying the same is, guess what? You don't get the growth you want. You don't get the vision you want. You won't get more sales. If anything, other clients will take over, fear of missing out, all these sorts of things. So whether it is an individual person and their mindset development or whether it is a client that you're trying to get back on board, risk of staying the same paired with the wider vision. And that usually is enough to generate momentum because, again, we're speaking to the primitive brain. That's the one who's stuck. Yeah.
I know from my own agency days, but also we see it now and I talk to lots of people. They'll have this sense of frustration. So we agreed to do something and we wonder why this great relationship, as you say, and there might be reasons why the vision didn't pan over. And all the things you've said, I can absolutely resonate with and I've experienced. But I also, that point of when you are particularly in this space, maybe selling somebody an idea, or they've got an idea as a creative thing, and they're sold on the passion or the vision or the glitz or the glamour, whatever it is, and then they say the reality comes down to everybody doing their part.
Yeah.
And I saw a big change when we changed the way we manage projects. Was making it very clear at the outset what our expectation of that client was. We do it now at MAP. We're very clear where we say we'll start at this level and we'll do it in slow bite-sized chunks to get you to the right things. There's no fairy dust here, but you can go as fast as you want to go. But unless you take those steps with us on your journey, we haven't got a silver bullet for you.
Yeah.
So I suppose the question is, how far can you go to retrain your client or retrain the relationship with a client?
This is probably where we do overlap with culture. Because values is something that is, and you mentioned it when doing interviews at the start of this, but I personally feel as though values have been, I don't know, almost degraded in a sense over the last few years to being fluffy, just words that sit on a website or some rubbish that you put in an onboarding with somebody new to a company. They don't mean anything anymore. And I think people have lost what values actually were for. And actually, this is exactly one of the areas that values comes into their own. Because I want to reframe the idea of what values are. Everybody has their own definition, okay? So some will argue with me on this, and that's perfectly fine. But in my world and from my perspective, I use values as a filter for boundaries and expectations. That is what it's for. And with clients, this is the exact scenario where you can use it, because so often you will get exactly a situation like that. And but it might be more severe. It might be that you have a client that's making people on your team cry. I've seen that before, where they just tear into somebody. I've seen that many times. Another great example, scope creep. And it's usually because, again, boundaries and expectations were never set. So how do we rewire a client, right? First things first, if you have values, we need to get them in place that are actually setting boundaries, expectations, etc. So we need to just take whatever values you've got and actually make sure they translate into being useful for you. Not, again, just a bunch of words that sit on a website. If you don't have values, we need to get them in place as soon as possible. But this is the thing. You can't force somebody to comply. You can't do that. You don't have any control over anybody else. You do have complete control over what you do in the situation. So now we're down to two things. Number one, you have to know what you want out of this relationship and the fact that it might not go the way that you want. You can't save every customer relationship. And if you have a toxic client, is it better that you get rid of them than keep them? You have to sometimes have those conversations, because with any client, it is never too late to reset boundaries and expectations. Even if you've been working with them for a year, for 2, 3, 5, I don't care. It's never too late to say, we're changing a lot of things internally. We're really excited about it. We're planning on growth. We're doing this, that, the other. And as part of that, we're resetting a few processes and a few things within our organization. So there's going to be a couple of changes coming, but don't worry, your account manager is going to speak to you about it. That's the simplest, easiest way of resetting boundaries. And then you put in the conversation with them. Now, at that point, you have no control over what they do. They might hate it, in which case they are not the client for you. Why? Because they do not match your values. And values are not fluffy things like, oh, we're proactive and empowering and crap like that. It's
innovative.
About, we're innovative, we engineer change, we do all these things. It's every place will start with words like that, and that's okay. But values should be boundaries and expectations. Why? Why do we need this? Because we do the exact same thing with individuals as we do with clients. When you have a conflict with somebody internally, whether it's just somebody on your team or it's a major client, it is almost always, because we're a social group, down to a conflict of expectation. When you open your eyes in the morning, you sign up to a contract with the world about what you expect and what your boundaries are, what your standards are. And when you come across somebody in that day that doesn't meet your standards, you know it because you say things like, well, I wouldn't have done it like that. I wouldn't have treated somebody like that. I wouldn't have cut somebody off on the motorway. And you know immediately that it's because that person does not align with your values. Now, I have to break it to you. That does not mean that you're right. Because in that other person's eyes, they're right. Because they signed up to a different contract with the world. And in their mind, those standards and expectations are perfectly fine. Because if they weren't, they wouldn't do it. So it doesn't mean that you're right and they're wrong. Doesn't mean that they're right and you're wrong. It means you're different. So that's why values can be so beneficial to your culture, because it means that when you get a client that refuses to change, it acts as a filter and a way of resetting boundaries and expectations. Okay, look, we have to accept the fact that if we put these changes in place, this client might have an issue with it because they've constantly been testing our boundaries for years. They contact us out of hours. They're really blunt with our staff. They don't respect them, etc. Do you want a client like that? And this is where you have to make the decision. Are you going to stand for something, which means that you're going to get the growth that you want? Or are you going to bend to everybody? Because if you bend to everybody else's standards, that means you have none of your own and you end up with chaotic, reactive growth rather than intentional, strategic, purposeful growth.
That really resonates with me. One of the reasons we have done for a number of years the value-based interviews, Caroline, is we did a lot of work on values. And as you said there, they can't just be on your website. They can't be 6-foot letters on the office wall. And you have to show your team that you're committed to those values in your culture. And unless you are prepared to disengage a client on a values mismatch, then you don't stand for anything. And we do see lots of clients who will make an excuse because you said about growth. And very often there is an obsessive seeking of growth, and they will justify what I would call the bad client. And too many people I speak with, the bad client can sometimes be either the person who's got the highest billings or sometimes the fastest growing billings. But we sit there and say, but what's that doing to your own culture, and what's that doing for your team, really? And maybe that's a segue to go on to culture and team. One of the things that you said there is the fear. And then there is the, if you like, the let's just use the rumour mill, the jungle drums, whatever we're going to say, and the sort of the tribal noises that fear can spread across the business. Two questions. How do you contain that? How do you create a culture that allows you to, I suppose, first of all, recognize, contain fear? But how do you, more importantly, if you're going to go for growth, how do you get a culture that actually increases people's curiosity? So rather than be frightened of change, I believe my team will be more excited by this change opportunity than somebody else. How do you get to that point?
So, containment. How do we stop stress from spreading, right? First of all, middle management is your biggest advocate. People don't use them enough, really, because I one of the reasons I do training at that level is because they are so often overlooked. You know that if you reach kind of director level, that it's like a perception that if you reach that level, you are worthy of investment. And they
Yeah.
don't realize that you don't get to that level unless you have investment at an earlier stage to provide you with the skill set to become a director later on. The reason why that is so important is because if you train your middle management in change resilience, change adoption, and I don't like soft skills, human skills, that will enable you to lead effectively and, most importantly, empower your team rather than create a team that just comes to you and you become a bottleneck over and over and over again. If you give your middle management that level of skill, it takes the pressure off massively and means that before, let's say that you've got a problem in like one department in a junior exec, and they have a massive mindset problem, they're massively stressed, they make a mistake, maybe they go to somebody else that's at their level and they panic more. They go as far as their management, and then the stress is contained and it goes down. The problem when you have no skills for how to do that is that, well, this junior exec can then speak to this one. And because their manager's more interested in self-preservation and being a bottleneck and checking everything and everything else, let's say that that person is on holiday, right? So that means that then it'll either not get flagged because, oh, well, I'm not in a culture that allows me to make mistakes and makes me feel comfortable with the idea of failure, because failure, unfortunately, has lost its importance. It used to mean learning when we were kids. Now it means bad, negative, not allowed to fail. So if you have somebody that gets put into a stressful situation, maybe it's a client, something like that, you end up, if you do not have a well-skilled, trained middle management group, that then escalates because that stress is then passed on to maybe somebody else in the team, then into the manager because they're overwhelmed. They don't know how to manage stress either. So then they either take more work on board, or they overload, or they don't handle it as effectively because they're not trained in how to. And that means that, let's say that the junior feels okay with what's happened, but then the manager takes a lot more stress. Maybe they feel like, well, I can't trust that person now to work with that client, so I'd better take on more responsibility. They end up burnt out. That then escalates above them. So stress is incredibly hard to contain when you are not given skills for building resilience around it. And that's why middle management will always, I like to see them as the buffer to that, because the people that are the most likely to be stressed over minor things, we're back to how resilience builds over time, right? So if you're more junior, you're going to be really stressed out over your first ever pitch. If you're a manager that's done it 1,000 times, you're not going to get stressed. It's just another day at the office. So it means that the people who are the least resilient to it are probably going to be the youngest at the bottom, which means that, first of all, you need a middle management that can contain that stress and can help them work through it, use it productively, use it as useful learning opportunities and see it for what it is, rather than them just getting stressed, absorbing it, or not dealing with it, and then it snowballs into different people. And then you have stress execs, you have stress middle management, and then that inevitably ends up coming to the board as every department is underperforming, we're not getting the sales we want, etc. Because when you don't have a middle management layer that is adaptive to change, that means they naturally stand in the way of it. We're back to inertia, right?
Yeah.
So I truly believe that the way that you can contain stress is by upskilling people appropriately. And then by nature of upskilling them, you're upskilling everybody that comes into the business, because those people are naturally going to be able to coach and support people with how to manage their own stress that are coming through at a lower level. They then become managers, they're already trained, and so the cycle is complete. And at every layer you have containment. If you don't do that, then you end up with, well, burnout in certain teams or in certain individuals. You end, especially high performers. High performers are the most susceptible because naturally they don't stop. Their standards and expectations are way higher than they will probably ever even hit. But it's something that needs managing, and it can be managed just with the right skill set. So when we come to containment, middle managers are your biggest advocates. When we're talking about how do we create the right culture for that, and your second question, people need time carved out to think. It doesn't happen on its own because inertia of direction, of motion, right? If you're already moving, you don't stop. Yeah. And if you want a team to be more resilient to change, to be more resilient to stressful situation, pressure, if you want your team to be more regulated, you have to put processes in place that develop it and ensure that it happens. So one really good example is that businesses always wish that their teams were more proactive. That's always something that comes up. But think about what that word actually means. Well, proactive is where you go out of your way to go above and beyond, or come up with fresh ideas or different things. Being proactive is doing something out of the ordinary. What we're naturally wired for is being reactive, which is why in high pressure, high growth, fast paced businesses, people rarely are proactive. And where they are, and it's in a high performer, they end up burnt out because they're constantly trying to take on too much. Proactivity comes when your brain is in a more creative state. It's in a more relaxed state. Why? Because if you're stressed, then again, we're back to the primitive part of the brain being in control, and that cares about short-term self-preservation, only just doing what we're doing, checking boxes, making sure that we're showing up. It's the other side of your brain that you need to engage. It's the logical, human, problem-solving, creative thinker, innovator, the one that's who we need to enlist in everybody if we want to have this culture that is resilient and breaks through inertia voluntarily. So how do you do that? Well, you must build in time and give them permission to think. Most people don't have that. And I've seen it in businesses before where they've allowed it might be either a half day a month or a day every couple of months, or however works for your business, where you essentially say this is dedicated time for you to work on a project that's gonna, like, let's say it's a development team, right? Work on something, play around with something that's going to benefit the business. It can be anything you want. Play around, because devs love playing around with code. If it's designers, you can do the same thing. If it's marketers, it could be completely different. But you're giving your team permission to take time out of the day-to-day stuck in the weeds. That carves out time for thinking. Unfortunately, thinking creatively is something that takes a lot more energy than most people would think, because you're breaking a pattern, you're breaking a habit, you're breaking through inertia. And in order to do that, it takes energy. And people need often to feel as though they're being given permission to do it. Otherwise, oh my God, but what if somebody finds out that I'm working on something that's different? And what? people aren't going to just naturally by default work on something, a completely different idea, because, oh my God, what if somebody finds out and thinks that, like, I'm not working on what I should be doing, or I shouldn't be doing this. We're back to tribal mentality. They're too afraid of getting kicked out, so they just won't do it. Proactivity goes directly against what a lot of businesses promote, which is we want you to show up, we want you to give everything, and we want you, we're happy to support you, but we want you to keep on doing all the things all the time and showing up and taking the action. Well, if you don't carve out time to take a different action, they won't do it.
I'll give you a real world example of that, Caroline, so I was a divisional MD in a PLC group, and the chief exec said, we have an open door policy and you can come and knock on my door anytime with an idea, which I took at face value. And I noticed a number of times that either all my ideas were bad or I'd caught the person at the wrong time. And you said something there, which is we're naturally geared to be reactive. So I sat and looked at it and reflected and thought, right, okay, why is none of this working? And it was this very simple case of, if I said, right, okay, look, I want to meet you at this time for half an hour in your diary to discuss this. This is the problem. This is what I want to put in front of you. I got a more receptive person, because obviously I realised afterwards I was interfering with what was obviously in his brain at the time. And his reaction was very quickly just to react. Rather than respond, he was reacting.
Yeah.
And we can talk about those differences. But I learned that lesson, and we try and do it now with staff appraisals and reviews for that reason. If you just sit someone down in a room and say, let's talk about your performance, as you say, the fear comes in, the shackles come up, the drawbridge comes up. Whereas if you say to somebody, hey, please, these are good things, but these are some issues we need to discuss. We'd like your view on this, this, and this, and give them time to reflect and think about it, you get a much more reasonable conversation. So I hadn't realised at the time that was probably just the way the brain was wired. But there's a real example of that thing, where the difference between allowing someone to respond to you rather than react to you.
Yeah, it's frustrating in situations like that. That is so true of so many businesses, where they'll say, look, we want you to just come up with ideas. Like, just be critical. Our doors are always open. You can always bring stuff up to us. You can always... They don't really mean it. And the reason they don't really mean it is because in that moment, the person that's speaking is the human in their head. The one that wants growth, the one that wants new ideas, the one that does have a fear of missing out and wants to, make sure that they're always innovating and all that sort of stuff. But the one who's sat in the room, who's in the weeds, who's in the day-to-day, and then has somebody walk in their door and say, can I just throw this at you? And you're like, oh God, I've got like 20 things on my... Now, the person who's responding to you in those moments is not the person who gave you the permission to do it. Which is why I say about carving out time in your organization and making that part of the culture. Don't just say, like, my door's always open. Actually carve out time, whether that's days or half days or whatever. You have to do it in a way kind of similar to what you've said. It might even just be part of a PDP, and it's on the individual to work out when that is. But the important thing is that to innovate, to create, to make time to strategize and think about the bigger picture and all those things that we talk about, takes energy reserves that most people don't have day-to-day access to, because they're trapped in the day-to-day of the usual actions that they have to get through and they have to tick off and they have to do. So if we don't give people the right structure, whether that's through initially permission and, you onboard somebody and say everybody has an allocation of 1 day per quarter towards something that's for themselves, or whatever it happens to be, I don't know. Unless you put that in place, the inertia of motion will take hold and people will just continue to do what they've always done. They won't break outside of it. That goes for directors and management as well, because they are still human. So just saying, like, my door's always open. Well, have you carved out time to listen to people, because if you haven't, then you're going to end up in the same situation. Only those people are then going to come to you and they're not going to get the response. Oh, well, I don't really feel listened to in this organization. Nobody wants to listen to my ideas. I'm always trying to be proactive, but I just get told later. So they leave and they go somewhere else. So the people that are proactive naturally get frustrated that they never listen to. And the people that aren't proactive are never given the space to do it. And the directors are trapped in the middle. Maybe they get caught on a good day and it's their relaxed state that's in charge, or maybe it's the primitive one that's in charge. But in order to create the effect that you want, which is change, positive change, growth, that requires energy. That requires taking a different action. And you have to make space to decide what that action is. But if you want it embedded into your culture, then it has to start with carving out the time to do it, because otherwise inertia of motion will take over.
You've spoken today, Caroline, a lot about, and we started this episode by saying, making decisions are half the story. You have to execute. And for where I use the word execute, you've used the word action. It's not enough to want to do something. You have to take the first step and the first action. So what would you say is the first step or the first action someone can take towards breaking out of a state of inertia?
If inertia in the workplace is caused by fear, then the first thing we have to do is work out where the fear is coming from. And inevitably, when we're looking at businesses and we're looking at growth and we're looking at a more senior level in the organization, there's two places where that comes from. Because the more senior you are, the more that the fear comes down to usually two things: uncertainty or a lack of control. You feel uncertain about the economy, the marketplace, the industry, the sector, the agency landscape, the whatever. And so that uncertainty drives behavior because you're acting in a stress-led fear state. You take clients that you know you shouldn't because you're scared nothing else is going to come in the pipeline. You obsess about competitors because you never have the time or carve out the space to think about what you could create. So you just compare. These sorts of things. The cheat code to uncertainty is clarity every time. That is why it is always the first step. Because if you want your business to change, if you want it to grow, if you want it to go in a different direction, the very first step is working out exactly what that direction is. How do you work that out? Well, you have to look at what success looks like. You need absolute clarity on, I don't care what they're doing. I don't care what they're doing. I don't care what customers we have right now. I care about where we want to go. I care about the type of customers we wish we could bring on. I care about the level of revenue. I care about selling in the next 5 years and what. You have to get clarity on what success for your company looks like, not somebody else. Because in order to get your results, you will have to take a certain set of actions and execute whatever strategy you come up with. But you can't come up with a strategy if you don't come up with what you're trying to achieve. The second thing I mentioned about control. We cannot ever have control over everything. We can't exert control over everything around us. We can only control what we do, which is why the cheat code to chaos is focusing on what you can control. And that's where the strategy comes in. Because the clarity on the goal, the objective, the milestone, the place where we're going is what treats the uncertainty. I don't have a clue what's going to happen, but I know what I'm focused on. And then the control is, I don't have any control over what other people do. But we have a strategy that we have back-engineered to get us the result that we want and a set of actions. So if we show up and take the action and we exert control over that, the result takes care of itself. So if you are one of those businesses that's been listening to this and thinking we're in a state of inertia, whether it's inertia of rest, maybe you've got people in your team that have been with you a really long time and they have a certain way of doing things and they're burrowed in there and they don't want to move. Maybe it's the inertia of motion and it's more about they keep doing the thing that they've always done and they won't stop, they won't deviate. Or maybe it's that direction and there is this resistance to changing a path and doing a different plan or a different whatever. It doesn't matter which one we're trying to tackle. If you are a business that's listened to this and has seen yourself reflected in whichever area, the first step is always clarity. You can have complete and utter control over what you go after and what you work towards every single day. You can get clarity again on what your original vision was, your purpose for being. Your company has got to this point for a reason. You started it, or the board started, whoever started it was for a reason. You have to reconnect with what that was, because that is the thing that makes you unique, and that is the thing that is bulletproof, because nobody can remove that from you. That's the reason why you exist. That's what can help you get out of that state. But it always comes back to clarity being that first step.
Really interesting. And I think, again, something I see across a number of organizations, Caroline, is that the founder starts it with a very clear vision in mind. And we see it a lot in this space, whether it's the advent or the change in technology or the change in market. And when you sit down and speak to some leadership teams or some management teams and say, okay, why are you not getting the results you want? When we really keep asking the why, and we come down to it, it's because it's become something different. It's no longer the business they started. It
Yeah.
no longer has the feel of, and I think that's a big thing, as you say, getting that clarity back and reaffirming the why you started sometimes is, and that can be, as we said at the start of this, going back into reassessing your values. And then the really difficult one is that, the people who've got you where you are might not be the people that will take you where you need to be. And that's probably a discussion for another day.
Yeah.
Um,
I just to build on that as well, it breaks my heart when I see it, because you will see it as well in the same way that I do. So often you will get a founder that works their arse off for 15 years, 20 years. It doesn't even matter. Even if it's 2 years, it doesn't matter, does it? That will put their blood, sweat, and tears into a business, and they wake up one day and they hate it. They ended up having a business that they resent, and it's because businesses almost turn into a living, breathing organism, all on their own. And for those, if anybody is listening to this and thinking, yeah, that sounds about right, it's because at some point, stress and reactive decision making became the default. And the human that had a vision and had an emotion behind it and had a real reason to create that thing disappeared into the background while the primitive version of them took over, and just getting through the motions every day, surviving, reacting, right, we've got to get more money in this month. Oh my God, how are we going to pay the salaries this month? Everybody's been there in the beginning. And there are good times and there are bad times in business. But if you are somebody that has woken up after, I don't know, maybe you're a designer that started a business because you just didn't want to work for somebody else. And then 15 years later, you've got like a graphic design agency and you're like, I was just a designer. I don't know how I got here. Like, I don't know what happened. And I'm supposed to be the business owner. I'm supposed to be the one that has all the answers. And I don't get to do any of the stuff that I like anymore. And that's because you let the business evolve on its own and run away with itself, rather than you being in control and you being in the driver. So we're back to, again, having clarity on what your vision is, but ensuring that you always come back to exert control over what you have control over. For anybody that is listening, is in that situation, I don't want that for you. And if you're in the early phases of starting an agency or building something or anything like that, I don't want that for you either. I don't want you to go 10 years and then hate what you've built. And it is never too late to bring it back on course. It was yours to begin with. It's still yours now, and you still have control over it. And I'm sure, in your clients as well, when you see it, it's a horrible thing to see in people, but it is not too late. And please don't think that it is.
I'd echo that. I'd also say it's never too early. I see lots of people who don't recognize the fact that the founder has a specific vision very often, and by, as you've said, as by an individual, they'll have a certain set of values. They might not have ascribed or prescribed those values, but they live by their own values. And as they build that team, they wonder why that business has become this unknown entity. And it comes back to that point about the culture is what you get, whether you design it or not. And your culture will be as good as bad as the worst behavior you tolerate. So
Yeah.
I would say to everybody, don't wait till it becomes a big problem. That's where I think people like yourself, Caroline, the kind of service that you offer,
Mm.
I'll be saying to anybody, understand how to build your culture before your culture becomes a problem. And that comes back to why lots of agencies fall over at 12, 13 people, because it was a collective before.
Yeah.
And we've had guests on here who've built amazing businesses who started off with friends and family.
Yeah.
It's a certain way. But as you start to build a more significant organization, culture suddenly becomes a problem rather than the seed on which you can build a fantastic business.
Agreed. And I think like coming full circle right back to that example you used, like the baker's dozen being being the unlucky number. I think it is because it is that point at which people start to break out of that. Well, you'll have probably heard it. Many agencies say it. Oh, we're like a family. We're all like mates. We all get on really well. But then, as soon as you start to broach out of that into the teens and into the 20s, you end up with some people getting promoted over others because they're naturally a better leader. And then you've got leaders managing their friends, and I think that's why culture becomes a problem. I have done workshops with businesses on values and creating a USP, but whenever I've done sessions like that, I've done them for agencies of like 50, 80 people. I've also done them for agencies of 5, because that founder is very clear on like, I want to make sure I get it right. And I've only hired a couple of people and I've gotten it wrong.
Wow.
So some people, just because of the experiences that they've had through hiring and firing, find out a lot earlier on in their founder journey how important values and culture is.
Yeah.
Some don't, because for whatever reason, they get lucky. They hire great people, they get to maybe 20, and then it's like, oh shit, something's gone wrong here. And they don't know how to fix it. And the great thing about values is that it starts and ends with you. It absolutely comes from you. Now, the only caveat to that is that getting buy-in from the wider business, and again using your middle management team as advocates in that, can be really beneficial, because if there is like a particular value that you want instilling, then helping them to be part of that creation and ideation process naturally generates the buy-in, because they think it's their idea. If they came up with it, they're bought in, and therefore they do the thing, they take the action. But no, I 100% agree. It's never too late. It's also never too early.
Okay. Well, listen, I always say the same thing. If anything that we've discussed today is resonating with somebody, whether that's we are in a state of inertia, let's say maybe worst case scenario, we are at risk of developing a state of inertia. How do they reach out to you, Caroline? How do they get your expertise in to talk to them?
You can get me on LinkedIn, or you can get me through my website. It's probably the 2 easiest places. It's just craftcoaching.co.uk, or it's just LinkedIn and / my name. Just drop me a DM anytime, and I'm always just happy to have a chat, have a brew in the beginning, and help you figure out. It might not even be a major thing. It might just be a quick conversation to get a little bit of clarity is all you need. It might not be as big of a problem as it feels. And it feels bigger because, again, we're back to stress, right? It amplifies everything outside of
and
it.
many
So,
people don't address it because they think it's going to be too big, too
too big, too
traumatic,
daunting.
and too expensive.
Yeah.
Totally. Okay. Well, again, a fantastic conversation. Thanks go out to Caroline for giving up a time again to talk through this fascinating subject.
No problem.
And if you've enjoyed it today, well, obviously, thank you for listening. And we will hopefully see you once again back in the map room. Thanks and bye for now.